This presentation, titled Training Auditors for a Virtual World, comes to us from Karen Rawson. Karen, the Vice President of the DeSauer Group, specializes in implementing quality and information security management systems in the information and communication technology, the ICT industry, and beyond. With more than 10 years of experience training auditors using ICT and as a key developer for the ICT industry virtual instructor-led training courses, she has both the knowledge and the experience needed in training auditors how to implement effective audits using ICT. The DeSauer Group offers virtual and on-site training on multiple standards and performs internal audits and improvement projects with clients. Karen is a TIA Fellow, a certified TL9000 expert, a key developer of the sanctioned TL9000 training courses, and a supervisory master trainer. As a past member of the TIA Quest Forum Leadership Council, she has been a multi-year recipient of the COO CEO Award. And with that, take it away, Karen.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It's wonderful to get a chance to present again at the Exemplar Global Conference. This presentation about training auditors for a virtual world is not about, it's not the training for auditors, but it's about what you need to train auditors on. And I think that a lot of us have kind of felt like, oh, we do fine with work from home, we do fine with having people in meetings, but we don't. Many companies did not realize this wrecking ball that was sitting out there getting ready to come toward us. And so I'll give you today some of my rules for auditing in the new normal, and then we'll go on with, I'll show you what the rest of the presentation is going to be about. The first rule is that virtual is normal. I think we've all realized that over the last 8 or 10 weeks, that if we don't adapt, we're going to struggle. And second, rules for auditing in the new normal is that you can't just plan to open the laptop and start auditing. There's a lot more that goes into a virtual audit than goes into just clicking a link and joining up to be in a meeting. And then the third rule, this is not my rule, this is a rule according to the IAF and ANAB, the accreditation body that accredits the many of the US certification bodies and other certification accreditation bodies around the world. You can audit remotely if the audit objectives can be achieved. And that means that you can use remote methods for internal audits, supplier audits, CV audits, and even certification bodies can be assessed by their accreditation bodies using remote methods. But that's only if the audit objectives can be fulfilled. So we'll talk more about what happens if you can't fulfill certain audit objectives. We've been teaching virtual courses and performing remote audits for more than 10 years. So when I got ready to prepare this presentation, first I just brain dumped everything that I knew about training virtually and performing remote audits. And then I said, oh, you know, there's a whole standard that talks about this in ISO 19011. So I read over it, everything it had to say about virtual audits, remote audits, and I realized that everything that was in there, I had already covered in the presentation and then some. But just to show that the standard that talks about auditing, the guidance document for how to audit has a section in there about remote auditing, and this webinar pretty much runs through everything that's in there and then some. So what we're talking about today is not the training itself, but if you're responsible for keeping an audit team ready to perform remote audits, or if you're performing them yourself, these are things that you would need to know and become familiar with. Who needs training and why, how to train your auditors, what to include in the training, and then the last three parts are how to do a risk assessment on your organization and how to 6 tips for auditing in the virtual world that kind of summarize what we've done. And because we're remote, the Q&A will be remote as well. You can enter your questions within the platform, I believe, and at the end I'll also give you my email address and phone number. So write down any questions you may have, including the slide number if you wouldn't mind, so we can go back and answer those questions, and I will address every email I receive. And I'll also post it up on our website, the Q&A from this webinar and others that we've done. As far as who needs training and why, it's not just the internal auditors who need training on the methods that'll be used, and we'll go over all the things that internal auditors and also supplier auditors need. The one thing supplier auditors may need that internal auditors don't is additional training additional familiarity with, if not training, different platforms than their own company uses internally. So if, for example, you use Zoom internally, but your supplier uses WebEx, you'd want to have some experience with that before you go audit them. And in particular, internal auditees. Within your company, when customers audit you, if the customer wants to use their platform, then your auditees should become familiar with that. So just as a courtesy to whoever's hosting the audit, you want to be sure that you're familiar with the tools that they use, and you don't spend a lot of time up front working out those kinks. Do that in advance. Practice at home. Well, of course, CB auditors and AB assessors who are doing audits remotely would need training, and then the auditees themselves need a certain amount of familiarization so that they're prepared for doing an audit, for participating in an audit. And we'll go over some of those items as well as we go through what the internal auditors need. Anytime you look at competence required for a task as required in Clause 7 of ISO 9001 and the other NXL requirements, other standards based on NXSL, you need to determine the competence requirements. And then, of course, if you're providing the competence, if you're providing the training to reach those competence requirements, you need to decide if you're going to have internally developed or externally sourced training. You also need to ask yourself, is this a good time to advance competence in general? Is it a good time to add audit skills refresher training? Or maybe even it's a good time to add new auditors to the program, give them the whole audit course and integrate remote auditing methods in the course. The thing about refresher training, or bringing somebody in who's audited at another company, or a CB who's had auditors dispersed all over the country, they know what they know. They may not know what they need to know. They may need some reassurance about, is this legal? Is this going to fulfill the requirements for the audit? Or what are some tips I need to be effective at this rather than wasting time dealing with the technology or other barriers we may have? But you, as the people responsible for providing competence, ensuring competence, you need to pay attention to what they need to demonstrate. And for that reason, when it comes to how to train auditors, what the DESARA group recommends is that you use virtual instructor-led training when you're teaching how to use remote methods. This is the way that we train auditors for remote methods, and it's the way we conduct our straight up what's involved, what are the requirements of a standard, and how do you implement a standard. We have used virtual instructor-led methods for training and workshops of all different kinds. The reason you want to use virtual instructor-led training is that you want to allow the trainees to practice with web conferencing tools and to model the good skills that a good instructor actually uses for getting participation and making sure that questions are answered in a timely manner, making sure that audio and video works just fine, and sharing documents and so forth. So within a training class that's virtual instructor-led, you should not be looking for something that's just an e-learning course, something you just throw out there to everyone, watch this before you do an audit. Because what you want to cover with your trainees are all of the what-ifs and the best practices, the things that people in the class have learned from, gee, I made a mistake when I tried this and this works a lot better. Or what happens if such and such sticky situation comes up? People won't ask those in a large group environment, and they're unlikely to think to just email those questions to a trainer if they've taken e-learning. So we strongly recommend having a virtual instructor-led class for auditors who will perform virtual audits, remote audits in the future. We also recommend that when it comes to training, that you have your trainees use their new skills as soon as possible after training. Because what can happen is that people attend a training program and they wait 3 or 6 months before they use those skills, unless they actually are very conscientious and go back and look at the book or sit down with somebody who's been doing it since then. A lot of those skills are likely to need a little brush up. So even if you have to double and triple people up to do some audits immediately after the training, it's a really good idea. It's also a really good idea if you're used to having your experienced auditors audit alone, go ahead and partner them up with someone who's less experienced or even someone who's just as experienced, because they will learn from each other. And this is a great time to cause your auditors who may be used to working alone to get some additional skills and feedback on their performance. Now, when it comes to training auditors, You want to be sure that at the end, because what ISO 9001 and other Annex SL standards say is that people have to be competent to do a job before they go out and do it, or you have to provide other methods to check up on them, where you may have some of your experienced auditors working with those who maybe are less experienced or didn't get the chance to attend the remote audit training. You just want to be sure that each auditor has a competence check. Now, that may be done as part of a virtual instructor-led class, or it may be a follow-up that they have to do before you give them their certificate that says that they complete a remote auditing readiness checklist before an audit. And people expect the next click of the slide is going to reveal the remote auditing readiness checklist, but I don't. And the reason that I don't give you that checklist is that we develop it in class specific to your organization. There are going to be a lot of things that are the same, and we'll go over those for the organizational risk assessment. But for example, years ago, I used to work well, I like to say I was a chip manufacturer, and people immediately think that I was manufacturing silicone chips, but no, I was manufacturing corn chips and potato chips. And in that environment, when we did a quality check, we actually walked through the facility and we had to use our eyes, ears, nose, and even mouth checking on quality of product as we went through. It was not unusual to open a bag of chips. I mean, it was expected that you would open a bag of chips, check the seal on it, check the date code on it, check the taste of it and the seasoning level. Not that your mouth was calibrated, but the easy mistakes of something that was not salted, for example, would be very obvious to an auditor. Or going into an area that was supposed to be clean, was there a foul odor? So there are some things that you just can't do in a remote audit, unless Google comes up with smell-o-vision or something. But you want the auditors to complete a remote auditing readiness checklist before each audit that they perform, so that the auditees and the auditor are both ready for the technology that will be used and what to expect during the audit, and so that they can find out if there are any limitations to the audit itself. Moving on with how to train auditors, you want to be sure that you reinforce the training by having a systematic process. You don't just have a training class and you send everyone out there to, okay, go use it. You want to update any procedures, update any templates, make sure people are using consistent tools. You don't have one person using FaceTime and another one using Skype and the other one using Microsoft Teams, which is the company approved method. There may be some tools that you want to be sure they don't use. So you want to reinforce your training with all these systematic processes and then communicate those processes to the auditors and the auditees. This is the kind of reason why you want to include in auditor training how we use the platforms. The guy says, we're meeting to talk about call, and then he goes mute. And you have all the different reactions as they go through it, and he finally picks up with elaboration. So we don't want that in our companies. We want to have technology training so that everyone has a primary and a backup plan. They're not counting on just the one working, because what if it didn't? It was pointed out to me in a recent webinar that WebEx has made their product, not the enterprise level, but an unlimited meeting time version of their WebEx platform, available for no charge during COVID-19. There are other no-charge options so that they could act as your backup plan, but some of them have a limit on how long a meeting can be or how many people can be in that meeting. So you want to be sure you check your backup plan and is it appropriate to be a backup plan. And then you want to have your auditees trained and ready to use that as well, just in case. You want to tell people what not to use in case you know some things that you just don't want them doing. Taking pictures with their personal phone and sending them off to an auditor, for example. You may say, don't do that because it just copied that picture into your personal directory on your home computer, and I don't want stuff from my business out there. So be sure you give technology training what to use and what not to use, and that the auditees are prepared with a technology briefing, and remind them that everything they show will need to be available to an auditor either through screen sharing or through camera sharing, that the documented information and the visibility of what the auditor needs to look at can be viewed. Technology briefing includes a number of things that we'll talk about a little later in this presentation. So for example, you want to go through confidentiality rules. This is very important for supplier and CB audits in particular, because information is going outside your company. But as I said, confidentiality in case something is being copied to someone's personal device. That would be a confidentiality rule that you may not have considered before because people don't typically send things around using their personal device. And that may be good training for people to have just in general going about their business, that they do or don't use certain tools and methods. And then you want to look at security rules like, how do we transfer files? Do we put them in a vault? One of the best practices I heard of was a company that was working with its contract manufacturer on, they were over in China, and the company that was employing the contract manufacturer was here in the United States, and they really couldn't be flying people over to China during COVID-19. So what they did was some very detailed videos of the production line and work using high resolution cameras, and they put them in a, it may not have been Dropbox, it was probably a secure folder on some service that they all agreed to use. It might have been on SharePoint or something. I didn't ask them what they used, but they put it in a secure vault so that both sides could get to them. And then when they had their interviews, they went through those videos together rather than trying to ask questions with a wobbly camera being used handheld during an audit. Well, here's what not to do. You don't want to have the auditor show up and say, "Are you ready to start the internal audit?" And they say, "We can't see your slides." And then they say, "Well, did you get the download? Or we try to email it? Or how about this transfer? How about that transfer?" And the person finally says, "I'm not sure how to present to you." And the auditee says, "Can you fax it to us?" Well, that would probably more than likely be going the other way, I'd hope, with the auditee saying, "I don't know how to present to you for an internal audit," because we'd hope that your auditors are readily trained. But that's why you want to include auditee and auditor training in your plan for doing remote auditing. What else to include in auditor training? Well, remember I said that each auditor needs to do, or we would expect when we teach a virtual instructor-led course on how to perform audits, we would expect them to do a remote auditing readiness checklist before every audit. The reason you do it before every audit, unless every part of the audit is going to be in a conference room, you want to check the sound quality in the actual audit locations. Somebody may sound perfectly fine on the telephone, but when you get them on a conference call with a screen open and they're talking over the speaker on their computer, maybe the sound is completely different and they need to be using a headset, or they need to go to a quiet conference room. Or maybe it worked fine when you were in the supervisor's office, but the second you go out on the floor, the noise is so deafening that you might as well just turn it off. So check the sound quality. Check how many people do you actually need to be in this audit. In the audit itself, 3, 4, 6 people may work well, 1 or 2 at a time. Sometimes, think what you would do in a real audit. Would you call the whole department in? Would you call the whole company in? And you want to have tech support available. This is why I recommend you go with 2 auditors instead of 2 auditors together, or an audit team member, an audit designated site rep who's at least available by cell phone, and however you can get a hold of them, text, whatever, so that you can get their help immediately if someone's having trouble. I really like it when it's a member of the audit team, if you have the resources, because they know what you're looking for and the urgency of it. You're not just put in a queue, but they need to be familiar with all the technology. This scenario with 49 people on a call may work for an opening and closing meeting, where you're going, one person is doing the speaking and virtually everyone else is listening. But when you get into asking interview questions, unless you've got a highly disciplined workforce, it may be very hard to see what you want on the screen and have all the individuals sharing airtime. We did a 9-person family Zoom call for Mother's Day, and it was kind of funny how we were all talking over each other. It wasn't any different than at the dinner table at my house when I was growing up. But you don't want that in an audit, so make sure you keep the number of people and the people who are trained in alignment, and you don't have tech problems. Now, here's an issue that you probably have to take into account in any kind of meeting that you have. It ought to be standard operating procedure right now, but you've seen it. People jump up when they get a text or a call. People are constantly on their devices and hammering away on the keyboard even as the meeting goes on. So work with your auditors to say, what is our company culture about this? Will we allow people to take calls, or do we expect for the 15 to 45 minutes somebody may be in an audit that they be able to turn off their devices? Train your auditors to set that expectation at the beginning, through the opening meetings and through the beginning of each interview, that we're clear that we are or are not having people who are, listening in and may have to jump up. But there's one more part that remote auditing brings in a little differently than conference room or walking around the facility type live audits do. And that is that you can have people barge into your meeting unexpectedly if they get the meeting time wrong, or if your original interview goes late, or if they, anything could go, Zoom bombing was one thing that was going on for a while there. I believe Zoom is taking care of that now, but where somebody uninvited finds a way into your meeting. So you want to have in auditor training both the security talk when you go through technology, as well as the let's set a norm for what we're going to allow for interruptions. And finally, either schedule back-to-back meetings in different conference rooms, essentially conference rooms, using different dial-in numbers for those different links to get into those meetings, or be sure you allow yourself enough time, and this is what I recommend, allow yourself enough time between meetings to keep notes. Where that'll be a problem is if you and another auditor are trading off and you're using the same link all day long to get in. So be sure you include that in auditor training, how we're going to handle interruptions. What else to include? Well, are we using drones to go up and down the aisles of the warehouse, or to hover over people as they're working in their offices or their labs? So here's a cartoon that what we don't want to have happen. We do want to include in auditor training the alert that you need to be sure that you're allowed into the area you want to audit. Are there any special considerations? We say coronavirus alert, but it could also be special considerations because you're visiting a design facility that says, it's one thing to allow an auditor to walk through here where we can see what they're looking at, but we don't want somebody with a high resolution camera taking a bunch of screenshots and seeing things in the background that we may not have intended to have out. We don't want to paper over everything that we use that we don't want seen in this secure environment. So whether it's coronavirus alert or any other reason why no visitors are allowed, you be sure you get that covered in training, that's part of your pre-audit checklist. Can we take cameras in? Because what if there's a security notice in general, no photos or videos allowed, and you were planning on doing a video conference for an audit in an area? So whether it's temporary or permanent, be sure that in your opening meeting, and you train to this, or in your audit planning, I should say, don't wait as late as the opening meeting, you've made sure that the auditor is going to be allowed to access the areas using the tools that you've planned. And then there's soft skills. Well, these should be observed before anyone becomes a certified auditor. Do they have the soft skills required to work with auditees and to be able to collect and analyze information? But it's very important in auditor training to go over what's different about this kind of audit, a remote audit, compared to an in-person audit. Some people may find it a lot easier to put someone at ease in a personal meeting in their work area than somebody who's uncomfortable being on camera. I have a line for that when somebody says, I'm working from home, I don't usually look this way. It's like, well, do you put a bag over your head when you come to work anyway? I mean, this is what we look like. Now, I'd have my video on today, except it is kind of distracting during a webinar like this to have part of the screen taken up with a picture. But suppose, for example, you have a manager who has gone through all the pre-webinar briefings and is ready to go, and suddenly gets called away, and somebody who hasn't been through the orientation is asked to take over for the interview, and they're uncomfortable. They don't know what they can show. They don't know, they're uncomfortable with using the tools. They're uncomfortable being on video. They don't know how to share documents. So the auditor needs to be prepared to guide everyone through this technology, as well as to put people at ease, and also to verify if there's any risk of fraud. Remember I told you about the company that was doing the contract manufacturer audit with the up-close camera of what was going on the production line? Now, when I'm auditing in a production area, and I do internal audits for companies, I'm not a certification body auditor. None of us at Desera do that. We contract out for performing companies' internal audits for them, which saves a lot of time and money in terms of flying around or doing the planning yourself and so forth. But when we do those audits, we make sure that we've got people prepared for every event. Well, I shouldn't say every, but for the eventualities that may come up in a remote audit that otherwise wouldn't come up. Now, reporting is a part of auditing. You've got to plan the audit, execute it with those skills we just showed, and then be prepared to put out an audit report. So when you're training auditors, you want to go through what is expected to be covered in the report itself. First of all, in the report, you've got to answer the fundamental question of, did we fulfill the audit objectives? So when you're planning the audit and when you're executing the audit, you're asking yourself that throughout. If my intent was to evaluate the compliance and effectiveness of every process under the scope of certification for this organization, was I able to do each part of that? Or were there some parts that are limitations that I have to go back and cover over? By the way, what I forgot to mention on the last one, that company that put all the information in the vault, the video information in the vault. What you want to be sure is that you were able, that was a lead into this slide, and I just forgot what I meant to say, that you want to be sure that what you see is actually a full description of, is fair representation of what's actually going on in the area that you're auditing. Not so hard when you're looking at software development or things where everything, order management, where everything is handled on a computer screen. It's another thing entirely if you're auditing a production process, because you're only seeing what the camera is showing you. And you're not seeing if there's a stack up of WIP at the end of the line that has errors that have to be corrected, or that there's non-conforming materials stashed just out of the camera view, for example. You want to, or that materials and tools aren't kept in an orderly way or kept up to date. There are a lot of things an auditor is going to look at with their eyes that you may have to remind yourself to turn into checklist questions, and use those soft skills to be sure that you're able to fulfill the audit objectives without making somebody say, "Man, you sure are being hard on us. You don't usually ask us questions about all those things. I've never seen an auditor ask about all that," because you're simply doing things differently, because you've got to fulfill the audit objectives. Also, to be included in your auditor training when it comes to reporting, is you want to assess the risks and mitigate them in advance. But if there are any problems, you've got to write, these were risks and this is a limitation of this audit. We attempted to mitigate, but this condition actually happened, and therefore we were unable to complete this part of the audit. You include that in the written report. Throughout the audit, you need to be looking for, as usual, opportunities to improve the process that you're observing. But then you want to look for opportunities to improve the audit process itself. That should be a given when you're auditing. But if you're doing something new like remote auditing, be sure you look for opportunities to improve, and you don't just go and implement right there if it's something that's outside of the systematic process. You need to change the process in an appropriate way, within the range of what you're allowed to change with what's personal preference. But if it's beyond personal preference, if you're trying new tools or new methods, you want to be sure that those are incorporated into the systematic process. And finally, I can't reinforce enough, in the report, be sure you include limitations of items that you need to, limitations of the audit itself, and any items that need to be followed up on site. Sometimes you can do the follow-up on site remotely by just having a person who is on site go and verify something for you. A technical expert who's impartial can verify things for you, but you may need to go on site. Like I said, we don't have smell-o-vision. And the thing that I didn't mention here is that when everybody is used to sharing all these documents in a certain way during the audit, how are you going to handle the reporting both verbally and in writing? It needs to be clear from the audit plan and brought up in the opening and closing meetings how you will distribute a written report. Is it just available online for everybody to look at, or who will get copies of it? That may not have been such an issue when people were just being interviewed in person, but they may have more expectations that because it's done in what looks to them to be a more formal way with cameras on and computers and stuff, that they should automatically get a copy. Just be sure that that's clarified before the audit, what's appropriate for your company. This is the money shot. This is the one you want to be sure you take notes on or take a screenshot of. And in fact, the next 4 slides, as we wrap up the presentation, all fall into that category. First of all, an essential skill for remote auditors is understanding the technology. As we said, a primary and backup platform, be able to guide the auditees in advance, you test and practice in advance, and you have, I didn't write it down here, but you want to be sure within your process you've got the tech support person defined. Who do we go to in the middle of an audit if we have problems? Second, in the planning, you want to be sure that you go over in training and that the auditors are prepared to address confidentiality and security and to explain those to the auditee, because auditees may have questions of how do I know this is secure, or what tools do you want me to use? And then you want to go over in the plan, like we said, the place, the timing, the restrictions, the risk mitigation, and you want to be sure that you've got participation from all the right people who are also briefed on how to perform. You need to listen on multiple levels as an important soft skill, not just the looking with your head on a swivel that you would do in an in-person audit where you've got a lot of things going on you can look at. Now you have to use your ears more. Are people forthcoming? Do they need some more reassurance? Are they getting everything out, or are they withholding some things? Is there a potential for fraud or somebody covering something up that they don't want you to see? Look for the things beyond what they're saying. You as the auditor need to be sure that all voices are heard. This is a little different from crowd management when you can see somebody who's about to speak or somebody who's fading back and not really participating. You want to guide and direct the conversation so you get the variety of diverse voices that you may need. And then making sure that you handle interruptions, hesitance, noise, things like that. Be sure you can take those in stride, adapt for them on the fly, and keep people at ease. The last essential skill is one that we're going to go through on the next slide. We've talked about doing that competence check that has the remote auditing readiness checklist for each audit. That's a form of risk assessment. That's the each audit part. But you want to do an organization overall preparation checklist to be sure that the organization's risk of doing remote audits are addressed. And then anything that is an opportunity to improve, you want to mitigate in advance or do it in a systematic, structured way. The organizational risk assessment. You want to copy this one down too. These are 8 points that you can that you want to include in your planning overall. Before you even start training the auditors, you have to think about what competence do they need to have and what capabilities does our organization need to have. First of all, if you've got an established culture for virtual meetings, that's good and bad. Good because you've probably, I hope, if you've got a solid culture, you've already got tools defined and people are comfortable with using them. On the other hand, there may be a culture for virtual meetings that says, oh yeah, we've got a lot of people who go to virtual meetings, but not everybody who might be audited, and people are not leading the meetings, they're attending other people's meetings. So your auditors need to be brought into that culture as well. Then you need to be sure that if you have it or if you're just bringing it on, that you've got technology for remote auditing, complete with cameras that will have the resolution that you need if that's important. Document sharing, places that you're going to put all evidence related to the audit, for example, or how you will share information between auditors if they're auditing on different paths. Third, your risk assessment is, have we defined what confidentiality, security, and data protection policies are in our company? Do we have the intent defined? And then methods that support those for the transmission of information. You want to look at your organization number 4 and see if documented information is readily available online, and if not, how are we going to look at documented information with the cameras that we have available, or the fax machines, or the carrier pigeons, whatever it is we're going to use. How are we going to share documented information with the auditor when we need to? A company that's got a strong that has a strong culture for everything goes online is going to have a much easier time and far fewer risks to accomplishing the objectives of an audit than a company that's new to being able to show any record they may need to look at quickly and easily in a remote environment. Need not be online, but how would it be shared if it's not stored online? Can compliance and effectiveness of processes be assessed remotely? So you would need to identify exceptions, such as things that need to be looked at a resolution that you can't ordinarily see with a camera, or in an environment that there's not the light or the Wi-Fi connection or whatever it may be. Identify those exceptions that require on-site evidence, Do that for the organization overall, so you don't leave some poor auditor out there saying, well, I guess they thought I was supposed to do this, but I don't have a clue. Number 6, assess the risk of fraud or intentional cover-up. Hopefully, internally, this isn't a problem, but it could be. So you may want to have an audit observer who's not the auditor, but is a disinterested second party, somebody who works in another department and not the group that's being audited, who's running the camera rather than the auditee themselves. So that, you have to look at other risks and how you might do those. And in some cases, you might say, we're not willing to, for example, bring on this third-party supplier without actually visiting their facility because they're so critical to us. So in some cases, you may not be able to meet the objectives of an objective audit if there are risks of fraud or cover. You want to be sure your procedures, templates, and tools are updated. That's part of your organizational risk assessment, not for any one audit. And then finally, make sure that the auditors are trained and have demonstrated competence before you turn them loose. And now we bring it to a close with the final 2 slides. Another one, you want to copy these down, 6 tips for auditing in a virtual world. First of all, that all-important organizational readiness check and audit risk assessments. So whenever I get ready to do an audit with a company, this is part of what I'm doing, whether I'm going on-site or not. I'm checking things like, do I need a hairnet? Do I need safety glasses? Do I need safety shoes? Because I want to pack if I'm going to drive to somebody's facility. I want to have what I need. If I'm going to fly, I certainly want to be sure that's, I had to go out and buy shoes on an audit once. So I learned that one just for an on-site audit. But also for each audit, have we done the risk assessment associated with it? And do the auditors know how to check those to be sure they can meet the requirements? And you have to create those assessments yourself. I gave you pointers on how to start them, but be sure your organization gets this. Second, you want to test and practice the primary and secondary platforms for each participant and location combination. So for example, in January, I was doing an audit where I had people from Chicago, New York, New Jersey, and London and Paris, all in the meeting together. So I did it one at a time with my on-site representative from each facility, and I made sure that I was using my client's platform. They use Microsoft Teams. I tend to use Zoom, but I made sure we were using their platform because that way everyone was familiar with it, and the meeting announcements would come through on their calendars as they expected. That was a courtesy to the auditee that I did in that case. A supplier auditor may say, hey, here's what I'm comfortable with, and I want my customer to use it. So test and practice the primary and backup platforms. Third, be sure that you train the auditors and update the tools and documents. You want to consider the logistics. Think of all those time zones I was crossing as we did that international audit. They may have had, special work days off in Paris that we were unfamiliar with, or certain people not working, and you get into it certainly with the logistics of a remote audit to be sure that people who may ordinarily work in New York and have taken off for the mountains and don't have as good a Wi-Fi connection as they thought where they're currently living, they're suddenly unavailable. So you want to consider the logistics of doing remote auditing, including things like the noise and the light and the social distancing methods that may be required. Fifth, have a technology helper on site for every audit. And sixth, beginning when you're planning the audits, socialize the remote auditing concept so that all interviewees are prepared for the changes. You may have, for example, a 45-second video by the audit program manager that says, hey, don't think you're off the hook just because we're not in the office to conduct audits. We are sticking to our audit schedule in most cases. Some areas we have to wait till we come back, or we have to do in a different way. But if you've been involved in the audit process before, expect an auditor to be calling you to set something up, and be prepared. If you need to dye your roots before you get on camera, no, don't say that. But I've had people say, oh, I'm not camera ready. So in what cases are we not using cameras, for example? People who have kids working at the dining room table with them may not want to have themselves on camera while they're being audited. Most of all, have patience, be flexible, and be willing to continually improve your process. This is new to a lot of people, and so you want to be sure that it's non-confrontational, non-threatening, and everybody's able to move forward with this, and hopefully, in the long run, make an even stronger audit program than you've had without using remote techniques, because you're able to get people involved who otherwise wouldn't be able to participate. So here's the final slide of the instruction. Is based on everything we've said. This is what Desera Group recommends when clients are looking at training their auditors and getting ready to perform virtual audits, or even having us come in to do their audits for them. First of all, that you do an organization readiness assessment. Are we even capable of doing this? Does it fit for our model? Second, we want to close any gaps that we find in the organizational readiness assessment, and then train auditors and check their competence. Socialize the concept. So even if you're having somebody come in from outside like us, we would want to be sure that our on-site audit guides are prepared, and the people that we're going to be auditing have the competence, even though that would be part of closing any gaps. But for each interview, we'd want to go through that. Socialize the concept, and then, well, you could call that for each audit that you're doing the planning is checking all those pieces for the audit. Do we have sound and light and cameras and documents and so forth for each audit? And be sure when it comes to reporting, you remember those things we talked about in reporting. And then, like any process in a management system, you want to continually improve the audit process itself, not just the processes that you're auditing. And if you take those 6 steps, I believe you can and will have an effective internal supplier or CB audit program that is effective even in light of social distancing or the need to be remote. In some cases, you may find that you're able to even audit more deeply in more areas, such as, for example, looking at an installation process where you wouldn't ordinarily send auditors out to look at those as many times in a year as you can if you're doing remote auditing techniques. So there are many benefits to doing remote audits, but it's a good idea to go through these steps and get familiar with doing at least some of your audits this way if you think that benefits your company. I'd like to thank you for participating in today's webinar. And as I said, I'd give you my personal or my business address and phone number down there at the bottom. My company is the Desera Group, deseragroup.com. And at this point, I'd like to throw it back over to Mike to give you a few further instructions on the seminar itself with Exemplar Global. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Karen Rawson, for that look at how to train auditors within a virtual world. And that concludes this presentation.